And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Friday, February 20th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I am glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, the government's first $1 million antitrust whistleblower award could reshape how companies think about risk and about their own employees. Plus, the White House has now scrapped the one-size-fits-all SBOM mandate and told agency leaders to own their cyber risk. Now flexibility will meet accountability. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Transportation Department is pushing back against the old adage, if it ain't broke, why fix it? Instead, DOT is looking at all of its technology systems and infrastructure and asking how they can drive better outcomes, particularly through modernization. For more on how transportation is modernizing many of its legacy systems, Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller, caught up with Pavan Pitagu, the Chief Digital and Information Officer at the Department of Transportation.
Let me start with some basics. Just walk me through a little bit about the idea to move to Google Workspace. What drove that? What was there a specific factor, or is it just you looked at the current set of tools and said, this makes sense now?
The first initial conversation was through curiosity, right? Like when that OneGov announcement came, was obviously interested to learn what is that OneGov deal about, and started exploring what are we going to miss if we don't. And then had deep conversations in terms of the roadmap, the native AI capabilities that would come in naturally. But most importantly, taking a 10-year outlook of the total cost of ownership as well. Productivity is the primary reason. Cost efficiency is a fringe benefit that came with it.
From a cost perspective, have you looked at and said, oh, we're going to save X amount of dollars yet, or Y amount of percentage, or is it just there's a bit of an assumption there just because you're going to lower the cost?
We did a cost comparison for over a period of years. So obviously, like I said, the cost avoidance or the savings, future savings, or the fringe benefit. The primary reason was how do we make it tools more efficient, especially the AI nativity in there. The
challenge of taking one kind of office productivity suite out and put another one, it's not easy. What have you found so far as you've kind of worked through this as maybe the biggest obstacle challenge that you've had to overcome?
I think the biggest thing to overcome is the fear of failure. A lot of people in the department would say, it's working today, why change? Right? I think that's the glass ceiling that everybody in the federal government has seen, especially in DOT. I can speak for DOT, will speak for DOT, is if it's working, why go through the pain of changing, right? What if it fails? It doesn't work. This is not something that we are the first organization in the world doing, right? Like, maybe the first one in the cabinet level ministry. GSA already uses it within the federal government space. We spoke with GSA. We talked about what failures they had, how did they overcome. We had their lessons shared with us. We started from that as our baseline, and we have our own learnings. If anybody wants to go next, we're happy to share our learnings so they don't have to start at our baseline. They'll start at a better baseline.
You're rolling this out slowly. You started with a small group. You've increased it. You said some core IT folks. Just walk me through the timeline. When do you expect this to be rolled out across the entire agency? Are you talking about a couple of months or sooner?
March 9th is all of DOT minus FAA will be completely migrated over, which is less than 180 days. I think previously when we spoke, I shared my philosophy of if we can't do any technological deliveries within 3 to 6 months of starting, what's the point of doing? Because the needs change, the requirements change, everything. So that 180 days benchmark is applied here as well. If we can't change a mail system in the back end less than 6 months, then we can't be delivering new capabilities in that pace. So 6 months.
March 9th is coming quickly. Obviously, you have a lot of work to do. At the same time, this is part of a bigger initiative around One DOT. You broke down the difference between you have some enterprise services you're providing at the CIO's office, and then you also have some product technology services providing to the mission areas. Can you just walk me through the shared services piece and how is that being set up or is set up?
So the shared services and the digital services, the primary difference is we build tech, we leverage tech to build tech, right? Whoever is building tech are part of the digital factories, the digital services group. Whoever is supporting the builders to build it better are part of the shared services, like infrastructure, cloud management, our cybersecurity, our portfolio management, like the FITARA compliance group that needs to manage the spend and report. All those things are part of the shared services. We also have put in data and AI in shared services as well as digital practices, because the governance of data and AI needs to stay centrally. So we have a framework, and then everybody that's building can go integrate those frameworks in what they build. So we're not limiting how AI is leveraged across the department.
These shared services, as you call them, have they been set up and you just built upon them, or was that fairly new, something that you instituted a part of the One DOT strategy?
So we had some of the shared services already established, like our infrastructure was already been in shared services. We actually expanded that into a One DOT IT construct to leverage expanding infrastructure's shared model to the other like cyber as well as portfolio and data. Again, it's not going to be the final. We are going to continue to learn from the current setup and continue to improvise it.
Pavan Pitagu is the Chief Digital and Information Officer at the Department of Transportation, speaking there with Federal News Network's Executive Editor, Jason Miller. You can find Jason's story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, the White House has scrapped the one-size-fits-all SBOM mandate and told agency leaders to own their cyber risk. Now flexibility will meet accountability. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. OMB's new memo rescinds the Biden-era requirements and shifts software and hardware security to an agency-driven, risk-based model. SBOMs and attestations move from must to may. That means CIOs and CISOs can tailor what they ask for from vendors, but they'll also carry the burden of proving these choices keep mission systems safe. We'll dig into what this change unlocks and where it could create blind spots with Jean-Paul Bergeau, Federal CTO at GuidePoint Security. Mr. Bergeau, it's nice to have you on the show.
Thank you, Terry, for having me.
We're going to talk a little bit about software bills of materials. At the end of January, OMB rescinded the mandatory SBOM requirements and replaced them with sort of a menu of choices, a risk-based approach. What does that really mean for agencies as they approach this issue in practical terms?
In practical terms, it takes away the compliance that they had to meet and more assigns them the responsibility to understand their risk and to assess how to manage that risk better.
So a lot of times people say that, well, we need more autonomy, we need more flexibility, don't make us comply.
Right.
Is that following that kind of logic, or is there a risk that we insert?
So yes, but it's funny. You have a catch-22 for agency executives, right? If you take away the requirements, then you make them make decisions and be held accountable for those decisions. So it's kind of a catch-22. A lot of agencies do say they want autonomy, they want to make their own decisions, but at the same time, that means they're more responsible for those decisions. And that's kind of what the administration is trying to do here, is to say, hey, we don't want to tell you exactly what to do because that may not be what you should be doing. We want you to tell us what is it that your mission requires you to do to hold these supply chain providers, the things that you're buying, software, accountable and know what risks you have. And we want you to define that and do it.
So the SBOM requirement has been around for several years now. What originally prompted the rule?
It was a breach in 2020 that had a supply chain hit and a very complicated and pretty ingenious supply chain hit where the software that was being provided from the provider was malicious because the bad guys had gotten inside of the organization and planted things in it. And that started a whole conversation around how do we account for this? How do we check on whether or not our providers are protecting us from another incident like this?
At the time, we probably didn't know what we didn't know in this space, and having a compliance checklist was very helpful in making sure people held to the bare minimum of security requirements.
I completely agree. I think having this compliance first and making people go through it, highlighting it, making a point of it was a good move. I think that was definitely something that forced agencies to acknowledge it. And now the shift, I'm actually a fan of this. I think I was a fan of the original compliance requirement, and now I'm kind of a fan of this. Hey, well, okay, we made our point. We pushed you guys to do a lot of things, and there was a lot of accounting and a lot of paperwork done. But now let's roll that back because we've made our point, and let's have you, Mr. Agency and leadership, tell us what do you need to be doing to correctly manage this?
So now that you're a fan, do you think the agencies have learned the necessary lessons over these past few years to actually be able to manage this well?
It all depends on the agency and the people involved. I think a majority have. I think a majority of the agencies have seen what they needed to, understood the challenge and understood the risks. And I think a majority of them have a good idea of what they should be doing. And the hardest part is making that decision, owning that risk. Now saying, hey, as a mission owner, do I just make it easy and say, well, I'm going to just keep complying with this and make that my risk management, which may be the right thing, it may not. Or do they take a different approach and say, well, I'm going to manage this to my mission that may look different than just a compliance of give me a bill of materials?
What do you think were the most important lessons that agency managers learned to make sure that they can now act with that autonomy and flexibility?
I think they learned what software providers were going to be easy to work with and get what they needed and what were not. I think there's been a lot of challenges with complying, especially for middle or smaller size software companies. And I think that's one thing that agencies definitely learned as they tried to meet this.
I'm speaking with Jean-Paul Bergeau. He's the federal CTO for GuidePoint Security. Well, let's move from the past then into the present. With the rescinding of this requirement, how do you think that agencies will adapt? Will they, as you say, sort of keep using the SBOM requirement just because it's safe and they know it works? Will they really step forward and develop some new criteria for the providers?
Honestly, it will come down to the personality of the executive administration of each agency. Some are headstrong and they really feel like they know what they want to do. They're willing to assume the risk to do different things, and they'll take a different approach and maybe take a more flexible approach with those software providers that may not be able to manage the cost of providing an SBOM or attestation the way that they want, and they'll look for other ways to do that, right? Some agencies are investing in SBOM detection software where they can just read it in and they can come up with an SBOM they feel comfortable with. Some are waiving it depending on what that provider is providing and the value and the risk they're willing to assume. So it's going to come down to the personality of those trailblazers who are willing to take risks to find new ways to achieve the mission. They're gonna deviate from that. Those that are more on the safety side and more on the complete risk avoidance are probably going to follow the original rule and say, I'm just going to stick to what I was told to do before, and I'm not going to step out of those bounds because I can always defend that.
How much more complicated does this make the universe for the software providers? Before, they had one rule, everybody followed it, it was nice and easy and straightforward. Now it's like, who knows?
It's a wild, wild west, right? Yeah, I agree. It is going to be differently more challenging. I think the attestation, the SBOMs was challenging, and many spent a lot of resources towards providing that. Now it's going to be, okay, which agencies do and do not require what, and how do we navigate that? It's a completely different challenge.
As the agencies move forward in this new wild, wild west, what tools should they be thinking about using to manage their software supply chain risk, especially when they're dealing with legacy systems maybe or other sorts of embedded software?
So there are technologies coming out and out that allow a piece of software to be analyzed and to some degree of accuracy provide an SBOM, a bill of materials, software bill of materials of the software that's being provided. And I think that's one area that agencies probably want to invest in because number one, they're not going to get an SBOM from some certain size innovation, smaller companies, and it's going to be harder to get that. But also, it would be really good to say, I'm going to double check you and see what I get out of my software from what you say is in your software, and I want to be able to compare that. So I would say that's the number one thing I would look at is some of those providers. Now, they do a great job, but the accuracy can be fluent depending on the software and the size of it and the complexity of it can make it vary.
As agencies move forward and they're all trying their own different approaches here, I would imagine that some will learn their lessons the hard way and have to retrench a bit. Is there a forum or a venue where you would want agencies to share their lessons learned here, sort of an evolution of best practices?
Yeah, I do. I think that would be a great thing. And I think that somewhat exists through some of the connectivity that the agencies have to each other. In some cases, it's up through, hey, CISA is keeping us accountable, or they're tracking things, or there's audits. Those kinds of things are a natural flow. I know that many agency leadership stay in touch with each other and try to learn from each other. And I'm a big fan of that. I think that's a great way for them to avoid others' mistakes and to share their own in private. It's hard to share your mistakes publicly. I can imagine anybody who's in a sort of risk management and leadership position doesn't want to get an audit that the whole public sees. So I think the current both CISA and OMB, GAO type auditing that sometimes some of that does not get displayed publicly for security reasons, getting those to other agencies and helping them see what has gone right or wrong with different agencies is the best model. And we do a lot of that now.
Just imagine that we're 5 years down the road now on this flexibility journey. What do you expect the impact to be in the long run? Is software going to be less expensive because there's lower compliance standards, or is it going to be more expensive or more reliable? What do you expect?
Potentially less expensive, depending on how agencies respond and how flexible agencies are. I think more likely the benefit, there's a lot of things you could say were positive or negative with this. The most beneficial thing I would say with this is it gives flexibility to adopt software that brings innovation that may not be able to afford providing you the attestation. So if you see something that's going to bring you an incredible innovation, you may be willing to run your own SBOM check or have some flexibility in a waiver to say, I need this. It's going to advance my mission. It's going to advance my agency. Sort of like you see right now where some agencies are able to get around FedRAMP and they do their own ATO, which is what FedRAMP is. It's an ATO where, okay, well, they're not FedRAMPed, but I will run my own ATO and I will do my own risk assessment and I'm going to adopt that software. It's a lot harder to do for FedRAMP because of the stringentness around it. Whereas this, I think, is very similar in that the biggest positive is the potential to adopt innovative software that just is not ready to meet the old standard.
I've been speaking with Jean-Paul Bergeau. He's the federal CTO for GuidePoint Security. Really appreciate you breaking this down for us this morning.
No problem, Terry. Thank you for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, a new executive order aims to rethink how the nation tackles addiction, shifting from treatment alone to a broader, community-anchored approach to recovery. But first, the government's first $1 million antitrust whistleblower award could reshape how companies think about risk and about their own employees. You're listening to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. DOJ's first antitrust whistleblower reward signals a more aggressive approach to rooting out market allocation and procurement-related fraud, especially in digital marketplaces. With employees now financially incentivized to report before companies self-disclose, the competitive landscape for leniency has shifted. We'll explore how enforcement is changing with Ann O'Brien, partner at Shepherd and co-leader of the firm's Antitrust and Competition Practice Group. Ann, it is lovely to have you back on the show.
Thank you for having me back.
It seems like it's been just yesterday, but it's been about 6 months since we talked about this new program from DOJ, a new whistleblower program. Before we get into the particulars about the news related to it, just kind of describe for me the shift in DOJ's posture over the last few years to really make whistleblower encouragement such an important part of their enforcement approach.
Yes, they are really focusing in the Department of Justice Antitrust Division on this whistleblower program. That is an evolution. I think for a long time in the Antitrust Division, when I was there as a prosecutor, there was the focus on the Antitrust Division's leniency program, self-disclosure program, as really a primary source for tips and leads. And there was a lot of discussion for years in the Department of Justice Antitrust Division about whether paying whistleblowers rather than relying on companies and individuals to come in and self-report was a good idea or not. And those who were not for it pointed out things like when someone is paid, they can be cross-examined on trial on that payment. You're a paid informant, and there's downsides to that. But I think we're at a point now where the Antitrust Division has seen leniency applications, self-disclosures dwindle a little bit, and they're looking for other tools. So, like we talked about in July, here comes the Whistleblower Rewards Program, and it's a program announced in July between the Antitrust Division and the U.S. Postal Service. And what they want to do is pay out antitrust whistleblowers who have evidence of antitrust crimes like bid rigging, price fixing, market allocation. They want to incentivize people, and it can just be regular people who have seen this type of conduct or those involved to come in and to report it to the Antitrust Division. And that's a tip and a source and lead for them to then go investigate and prosecute.
Well, at the end of January, they announced their first award under this program. What struck you as significant about this big announcement and this first award?
Yes, and when I was here back in July, I was skeptical about the program's memorandum of understanding that really was a little complex, as you pointed out, and had a lot of nuance to it and a lot of discretion. So I had a lot of unanswered questions about how quickly, how much money would be paid out, and the nexus to the Postal Service. So on January 29th, 2026, the DOJ's Antitrust Division and the Postal Service provided affirmative answers to a lot of my questions by announcing the first whistleblower reward. It was $1 million reward. It's a pretty significant amount of money to the whistleblower who provided information that led to a company, eBlock, to resolve criminal antitrust bid rigging and wire fraud charges through what they call a deferred prosecution agreement. And under that agreement, they agreed to pay $3.28 million criminal fine. And what they would do is pay that fine, and the whistleblower, they announced, was getting just $1 million, which is almost a third of that. So eBlock is a company that offers online car auction platforms, and so this was about bid rigging on those platforms. So why is this significant? I think 3 ways, and this really answers the questions I had. It was speedy, the amount was significant, and the underlying nexus was not too postally. I know that's not really a word, but let me explain what that means. On the speedy front, when I was here in July, I was skeptical that we'd see an actual payout of an award in under a year, but they beat it. In less than 7 months, the DOJ and the Postal went from rollout to payout, which is quick. I mean, as a 20-year Department of Justice veteran, I will tell you, in government years, that's light speed, right? I mean, things moved fast. So it's faster than we see in other whistleblower context, in the FCA, False Claims Act context, or other whistleblowers. It's fast. So the program did pay out quickly. The second is the whistleblower reward is significant. And it's not just $1 million being significant, because to an individual, we all know that is a large award. If you win it on a game show or if you're given it by the government, it's a lot. By all accounts, that's a big number. It's impressive from an outsider's point of view that the department so quickly paid out that amount. But it's not just the raw number. It's really if you look at the math. Because when I was here before, we talked about that the DOJ and the Postal Service, under the Memorandum of Understanding, said they would pay out 15 to 30% of the penalty. And they used an example where they laid out 20% payout. This is almost 30%. So the top end of that. Maybe they wanted to make a splash for the first person, I don't know. But I will say it's by all accounts significant, both math as a percentage of the penalty paid by the company, which is here a deferred prosecution, not a criminal prosecution and sentencing after trial, but it is almost 30% of that. So very significant, very fast. And then the third thing is I had this question, and many of us did, about how much are they going to require that there is a nexus to the Postal Service. So you asked me about that, and I used an example of if the Postal Service is a direct victim. So contracts for water, for instance, that the Postal Service, workers are drinking when it was hot here in July, But this isn't that. The nexus is very thin, quite frankly, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because it says that they're ready to pay out these amounts. And it's really the discretion that was the question. And now we see that the Postal Service and the Antitrust Division are implementing the program and using their discretion towards paying it out. And I think that's significant and will incentivize people to think about reporting.
I'm speaking with Ann O'Brien. She's a partner at Shepherd and co-leader of the firm's Antitrust and Competition Practice Group. And there's a quote in the press release that announced this award that I want to get your reaction to. And it says, "Remember, the first company in an antitrust cartel that reports its collusion to the Antitrust Division might receive leniency, but the race is faster now because employees and their attorneys are incentivized to blow the whistle and beat their companies to the division's doorstep." What does that sound like to you?
Well, it's a good quote. And I think keeping the race on, I can see why they said it. It's well said in that part. As a longtime antitrust lawyer, there's a different part that jumps out to me, and that's the word might. And the reason that jumps out is because they say, if you're the first company in an antitrust cartel that reports its collusion to the Antitrust Division, you might receive leniency. But the race is faster now, and it goes on. The reason that might is significant is that there is this tension, as I said at the top of this portion, there is this tension between self-reporting, leniency, companies or individuals coming in to self-report without a payment, and incentivizing people to come in and report through the whistleblower program. And the Antitrust Division has been very clear that both can coexist, right? But this jumps out to me because I think it's a signaling of, we now have another source of information. And you, companies, are in a race with your own employees. You're in a race with potentially people at other companies that are going to come in and report. And if they report before you, maybe you don't get leniency. And there has been a trend and a tipping of this self-reporting leniency program, which has been wildly successful part of the Antitrust Division's criminal enforcement program, to be a little reticent, a little less likely to automatically give antitrust leniency when they didn't know of an offense before like they were. And I think there's a little signal of that. There's always been an individual leniency program since the early days of leniency. There was corporate leniency first and individual. So an employee could always come in and report. That race always existed in the leniency context. Now the difference is there's money tied to it. So they're focusing on that. So it's a different vehicle to get tips. And I think they're just like the Antitrust Division always did when I was there, saying this is a race to the prosecutor's door. This is adding a different aspect to the race. The race was always beat out your co-conspirator companies. If you're at a conspiratorial price-fixing meeting and one of your co-conspirators is an empty seat at the table, maybe they went in and reported. So you better be worried that they are and talk to your lawyers, your in-house counsel, your compliance folks, and see if you should run in and report. If an individual potentially that worked for you complained about, hey, is this right what we're doing? You'd get nervous that maybe they'd run in and report. Now this is a different aspect. It just enhances that race because you might have a person that comes in. And the way they came out quickly with a large award, it does make it part of the discussion.
Do you think this splashy award is a way to kind of open the floodgates? Are we going to see a lot more of these? What do you think will be next from the DOJ and the Postal Service that will build on this first case?
Well, they certainly want to send that message, not just that quote in the press release that you said, but I've heard this week the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Antitrust Division, the person who said the quote that you just read, he's saying that there's a frenzy of applications from whistleblowers. This was very quick how it came about. There is questions in the antitrust bar about whether the antitrust division is proactively reaching out to whistleblowers, maybe with False Claims Act complaints or securities or other types of whistleblowers, and say, hey, do you know about antitrust stuff too? Is this there? Proactively doing that. There's nothing wrong with them doing that. But I think they want to create this idea that there is frenzy. And I mean, I'm not questioning it. They're saying it. There's a lot of applications. So I think they want people to think there is all of these coming on the pike. So if you have an inkling of some conduct that we might find to be a criminal antitrust violation, rush in and report it. This is a good first step for them, saying this is real, this is quick, it's a significant amount. There's not a deep nexus to the Postal Service. So they're doing all the things. But I still think the proof is still in the cases that they're able to bring based on whistleblower complaints. This is a deferred prosecution agreement. So a company agreed to pay an amount. A deferred prosecution agreement is thought to be lesser than a criminal plea agreement. It goes away after the 1-year period that's in this agreement if they do everything that they're bound to do by that agreement, the company. So this is a first step, but can they make and prove cases beyond a reasonable doubt relying on a whistleblower? That remains to be seen.
So if you're an employee out there and you're thinking, I may have seen something, I may have some inside information that could be a benefit, might be reward worthy, what should they be thinking about?
Well, as I thought would happen when I was here in July, I do think that there is a lot of clamoring of lawyers to provide that service. If you went Googling whistleblower, or maybe now you're using a AI bot, but you are looking at, I have information on antitrust, I want to blow the whistle, I'm sure you'd get a plethora of advertisements for lawyers that would be happy to help you and likely take a cut of that. So that development of that bar, like we've seen in the False Claims Act context, like we've seen in securities whistleblower context, that's happening. That's happened. They're out there looking for people. They're advertising, so people would look that up. They could go directly to the Antitrust Division, and I think the Antitrust Division wants to promote access from individuals, and there's a website that lays out what to do. People need to be realistic that the reward, like any reward, comes with a lot of requirements. They will have to cooperate. They will have to spend probably more time than they like working with agents and reviewing documents. And that reward is not guaranteed. There's a lot of discretion. There's a lot of exclusions to the program. So at the end of the day, will they get paid? Still, there's a lot of discretion to be had. It's not a guaranteed award just because you rush in.
And can people who work for the government or the Postal Service get an award under this program?
Unfortunately, no. There are exclusions that say that people are ineligible for an award if they're an official, employee, or contractor of the DOJ, the Postal Service, or any law enforcement agency. And their relatives also can't get it. So if they are doing their job and they see this type of conduct, sometimes we saw procurement officials, law enforcement, Office of Inspector General, they're doing their job. They shouldn't expect to get award or reward under this program. I think the idea is you do your job. That's what you're there to do. So no, they're not going to be able to get it. I'm sorry to tell your listeners.
I've been speaking with Ann O'Brien. She's a partner at Shepherd and co-leader of the firm's Antitrust and Competition Practice Group. Ann, thank you so much for breaking this down for us. It's really interesting to follow up the memo we talked about in July with this first case. Thanks for joining me. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, a new executive order aims to rethink how the nation tackles addiction, shifting from treatment alone to a broader, community-anchored approach to recovery. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The White House's new Great American Recovery Initiative reframes addiction as a chronic disease that needs steady support, not just clinical services. A shift meant to close the gap between how many Americans struggle with substance abuse and how few receive help. It calls for stronger coordination across government, healthcare, and communities to make recovery more accessible, more connected, and more rooted in real life. We'll dig into what that means on the ground with Melissa Sosinski, host of the Empathy Affect podcast at Forcemarsh, who spent years talking with leaders and people with lived experience about what recovery really looks like. Melissa, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Terry. It's wonderful to be here.
We have a great topic to talk about, and it may not have gotten a lot of attention. At the end of January, the president signed an executive order announcing the Great American Recovery Initiative focused on substance use disorder and recovery. From your perspective, what is the core shift that this executive order is trying to make in how the federal government is thinking about substance addiction and recovery?
Yeah, I think coordination was a really key part, and it felt really familiar based on conversations I've had with other people in this field. A lot of the language in the executive order reflects things that a lot of federal, state, and local leaders have been saying and working toward for years. That recovery is broader than treatment alone, and that access works best when systems fit into people's lives. So the cross-agency framing also stood out in that regard, because recovery doesn't happen in one program or one moment. It unfolds over time and across systems. So yes, we see the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration's leadership involved, but we also see that the EO taps agencies like the Departments of the Interior, Housing and Urban Development, and Education. This points to the same kind of holistic, coordinated approach that we see in the field of recovery and how they're trying to take it on.
This feels to me very similar to the approach the federal government has taken in the past to homelessness, trying to create a really comprehensive, integrated solution space for individuals that face housing insecurity. What might you think this comprehensive approach to substance use disorder and recovery will ultimately entail?
So I think that we are going to be seeing a lot more going beyond treatment, which is where a lot of the substance use disorder rhetoric tends to come from. One example that stuck out with me has come from Palm Beach County, where the county's drug czar talked about how they implemented a recovery capital index. So instead of measuring success only by whether someone has completed treatment, they looked at things like housing stability, as you were mentioning, employment, and social support. So this shifted the conversation to, again, that more holistic view of recovery, asking whether someone's life has actually become more stable than it was before, and not just whether they've touched a particular service. This index created metrics around how people were doing across these personal, social, and cultural support systems. So what this all meant was it sort of formed a measurable way to determine a person's overall well-being and where their strengths were across their journeys of recovery. I think that this example sort of encapsulates what we're seeing with this executive order. It's a move toward what we're already seeing in the field with people trying to address SUD recovery in this holistic way.
There's a really interesting statistic in this executive order. It says among the 40.7 million adults who had a substance use disorder in 2024 and who did not receive substance use treatment, 95.6% of them, or 38 million people, did not perceive that they needed treatment. What about that describe some of the barriers both that individuals face in seeking treatment, but also that are going to have to be overcome by the structure that's set up in this executive order?
Yeah, it really is a shocking statistic. And we know that often for people, it's not that services don't exist for people to tap. It's that these services don't fit into people's lives. So people have busy work schedules, transportation barriers, caregiving responsibilities, or even the fear of stigma that can prevent people from really engaging. So that's why you hear so much focus on access in the recovery space. So one example that stands out to me is in San Francisco, we heard of something called a Night Navigator program. This is something that uses telehealth to connect people on the streets with support outside of traditional 9-to-5 business hours. It's really a practical way to make sure that services are there when people will actually need and use them. And while we know that what may be effective for supporting recovery, people's schedules and, again, personal obligations can prevent them from accessing services.
I'm speaking with Melissa Sosinski. She's the media content lead and the host of the Empathy Affect podcast at ForceMarsh. Melissa, let's follow on with that telehealth opportunity, I guess. From your perspective, where does telehealth make the biggest difference in recovery support? We're seeing it show up in more and more healthcare programs. How do people tap into it?
Yeah, just especially looking back at the pandemic when we were sort of forced into a remote environment, it became a big boon, and it remains one in the mental health SUD space because you can tap support from wherever you are, whether, it's in rural health situations or just like everyday support. We've seen it more at agencies like the VA, across HHS. And so seeing it become a tool that people in the SUD space have been using has been really great to see, and they're being creative. And again, like going down to that local level, I think is where we see a lot of the innovation and creativity in its application.
Are there still policy or operational barriers that limit how agencies can use these more flexible tools? I'm thinking here about crossing state lines, for example. Can you provide telehealth to someone in Minnesota if you're a care provider in Kansas?
Yeah, I think that with many providers, they need to be licensed in certain states. So there are barriers in terms of cross state lines, but many providers do get licensing in several states so that they can be available as telehealth providers in mental health, in SUD, and other kinds of spaces.
One of the big focuses of this executive order is also on workplaces. What do we know about how employers and especially managers can support employees who might be navigating a recovery journey?
I'm so glad you brought this up because we know that the workplace is ready to support people in recovery. What we hear consistently is that managers and colleagues want to be supportive, but they don't always know how. In one Empathy Affect conversation we had with ONDCP, which is the Office of National Drug Control Policy, we talked about a recovery-friendly workplace toolkit they were developing. So this toolkit centers on 4 pillars: prevention and risk reduction, training and education, hiring and employment, and recovery and treatment support. But just as importantly, this toolkit focuses on practical questions like how supervisors should respond if they learn someone is struggling, or how to help an employee access available benefits to seek help with their substance use disorder. And while this toolkit has been out for a couple of years now, at ForceMarsh we conducted a national survey with both employees and organizational leaders. And what we've seen is that managers are often the first person someone goes to when navigating recovery. So we know that the willingness to support is there, but the bigger gap is in the training, clarity, benefits, and policies. Recovery-friendly workplaces tend to succeed when systems are designed thoughtfully, not just when people have good intentions. The evidence is there, and it's great that this toolkit has become a resource for federal agencies and other organizations that are interested in becoming recovery-friendly workplaces.
It does sound like that toolkit would have lots of very useful information, but if there's a manager out there who hasn't heard about it, whether they're a federal manager or anybody else, where should they look to find that toolkit?
It is located with the Department of Labor. They have a page for it. You can download it. They have the tips in there. They're very simple, and also a long glossary of other information, so managers can point them out to their HR teams or to their organizational leaders if they're interested.
That is a very helpful resource. And as we think more broadly about how this EO might get implemented as it moves forward and the on-the-ground examples that you've provided, what is the most important thing you think agencies should keep in mind if they want to create an environment that is supportive of recovery, that it feels fair and workable in people's lives?
I I think starting somewhere is the best first step. What I've seen across conversations is that, recovery works best when systems are designed around real lives, not just ideal pathways. And there are evidence-based ways that people can implement these policies in their organizations. The executive order is coordinating federal agencies around this point and creating an opportunity to turn principles into everyday practice, whether it's in programs, in our workplaces, and how the government shows up for people.
There is a long list of things that this executive order promises to do, including how to implement programs that integrate prevention, early intervention, treatment, recovery support, and re-entry into all relevant public health, healthcare, criminal justice, workforce, education, housing, and social service systems. What will you be looking for in the future that would demonstrate that this executive order is having some impact?
Yeah, I think overdose mortality has been something we've had our eye on. The rates have been going down. But going back to that holistic view, we want to see people not just survive, but thrive. I've heard that over and over again. And to, hear people on the ground who are recovering, thriving, many of those people give back and end up working in positions where they are, supporting other people in recovery. Those are indicators. So again, it's beyond, whether people are, not dying from overdoses, but, where they go, whether they're thriving with their families, with their communities, in their jobs. I think those will be indicators, soft indicators, albeit, but, that's what really gets us from just the treatment to the recovery.
I've been speaking with Melissa Sosinski. She's the media content lead and host of the Empathy Affect podcast at Force Marsh. Melissa, thank you so much for joining me today.
Terry, it was wonderful.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. One of the key highlights of the Defense Department's recent memo on multi-factor authentication for unclassified and secret networks is the clarification that DoD public key infrastructure, not the Common Access Card itself, is the department's primary authenticator. Previous policies would often go back and forth between describing the CAC or PKI as DoD's primary credential, creating confusion. Plus, the memo finally introduces passwordless authentication methods designed to give service members faster, more flexible access to systems. For more detail, Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis spoke with Alex Antrim and Adam Oliver, Senior Solutions Engineers at Yubico.
The thing we noticed right away in reading it is the first thing they did is really clarify that DoD PKI was the primary authenticator across DoD. If you've ever glanced across previous policies, they really kind of bounce back and forth between DoD PKI or the CAC specifically when it comes to NIPR. And as any vendor who wanted to get into the PKI space with some kind of alternative form factor, they could go through all the troubles of getting it technically done, working with the proper teams to actually provision a credential. But then you could come along to an organization and say, here's the approval for PKI on our device. And they would probably throw at you a multitude of memos that said, well, it's the CAC. CAC is primary. And we've heard that, of course, along with anybody else who does hardware PKI tokens, I'm sure. And this memo right off the bat clarified that as PKI, which is the actual authentication credential, not what it's stored on, which would be the CAC or the token. And as you read further through the memo, it's also very clear that DoD doesn't plan on moving away from that as the primary credential anytime soon. In any use case where they're talking about CAC holders, where an employee actually holds a CAC, they clarify that if PKI is available, that is what you use, full stop. The next thing that was nice was they finally did approve FIDO2 passkeys. So previously they approved FIDO U2F. So the flow of username, password, and having an authenticator that you would tap as your second factor was what was approved. And now everyone's been talking about how do we get to passwordless, which would be passkeys, where you don't have to remember that password at all, and you can take it out of play. So now that's finally being approved within the memo. Now, unsurprisingly, DoD did not just approve passkeys in general. So it's not a bring your own authenticator type approval. They still say a passkey with a specific technology. So vendors will still need to come in, find an organization that's going to want to get it approved and go through the processes to find that memo to get it onto the list. But now that door is open. Previously, if you brought up FIDO within DoD, the reactions would be varied. You get some people that were very excited about it as a newer modern authentication method. It's also based on cryptography. But then you'd hit people that would go, no. PKI is the gold standard, period. We would never look at anything else. And the memo in those scenarios does really define, if a CAC holder gets a FIDO2 credential, how do you bind that to that identity and make sure that the FIDO credential is deactivated based on certain things happening with the certificate, such as it expiring or being revoked. So it's very clear that while there are a great set of alternative ways of authenticating that help reduce the issue of relying on username and password only, DoD is very specific about, for CAC holders, you are still tied to your DoD identity and the PKI credential associated with that. And we always, when we go in meetings with customers, we talk about use cases, because people will always go, I have a CAC. Why would I want something else? Why do I want another form factor? So we talk about things like, do you have your CAC reader with you if you're using your personal laptop or a personal PC? Did you forget it? Are you using something like a MacBook where you would have one integrated so you had to carry it around? Did it break? Did you lose it? Did you source it from a reputable source? Or is there a problem with the reader? Is there malware on the reader itself? So we talk about these alternative form factors of, you don't need that extra device, especially if you have, say, your personal phone. If you've ever used a CAC sled with a personal phone, they're usually nothing but headaches, especially if they're Bluetooth-based. So now DoD has taken these use cases that they've developed and fully listed them out. And every time in the past, we heard someone say, well, X is not authorized for my specific use case. Now you can go to this list and go, are you sure? Because your use case falls into one of these buckets, if it's not PKI. So that helps all those authorizing officials say, well, I want to map options to specific use cases, and now they know what they can improve. They don't have to try to guess and say, well, how do I follow 3 or 4 different memos to get to an approved authentication type with my actual use case? It's pretty much all defined out in one memo.
I just want to add on, Anastasia, from my perspective, one of the better parts of the memo was what Adam was just referring to is that those tables, right? A clear list of tables that have use cases, personas, possibly even a scenario to help organizations within the DoD clearly identify a non-PKI alternative for their environment, for their use case, for the people that need to get access. And that has always been a challenge in the past where organizations were looking to innovate and they could not get that clarity out of existing policies. And for myself, as a 24-year retired senior chief, I know the value of these types of authenticators. The Common Access Card has been an ID card first, and then it moved to authentication. But it is cumbersome. It's something I have to keep hold of. I can't lose it. It is very challenging to get a new one. And with these new alternative authenticators listed in this new memo, it gives many more options to organizations that are looking to provide easier ways for service members, warfighters, et cetera, to get access to critical mission data, whether you're getting gas or you're overseas in a jungle. And these options, these new technologies are critical for getting the warfighters' mission data faster.
Adams, I'm going to go to your very first point that you made, which is about them clarifying the primary credential. Why were they going back and forth between the CAC and PKI, and what issues has that caused?
I think mainly the going back and forth was just probably preference of who wrote the memo, or maybe what they read when they wrote their memo. So a lot of branches will put out a memo based on a DoD memo, and theirs may stick around for longer if DoD updates guidance. So it depends on personal preference. And the concern was always, for us as a vendor, when they say CAC, that kind of excludes anything other than that cardstock, that ID that Alex mentioned. Whereas if they say DoD PKI, any token that is approved by DoD to hold that PKI credential could be leveraged in these other scenarios. So now when you're looking at, I need to log into a device that it's not easy to use a CAC reader with. And in those scenarios, we had to rely on terminology such as the CAC was not feasible nor practical in that scenario, because that's how you saw things pop up in some of these memos. When really what they were kind of trying to get around to, I believe, was when PKI was not feasible more practical, which is where this new memo came into play. And all those scenarios, those use cases and those approved authentication methods are there because it's been determined that in those scenarios, PKI is not really feasible or can't be used. So they need to provide those other options because everyone knows username and password is just bad in today's day and age. But other than that, I don't think there was any other specific reason other than someone said, we use a CAC every day to log in. That's the credential. And that was kind of the assumption as they were writing a memo, instead of going to the fact of, well, what is the actual credential sitting on the CAC, on that card stock? It's, PKI credentials of a private key sitting on that card stock paired with a public key that does all the validation of everything the private key does, which coincidentally is actually the same way that FIDO works with passkeys. Private key credential and public key or public certificate that is able to validate what that private key has done.
I'll just add a little bit. I think that this new memo and those conversations that helped with this new memo realize that they need to remove focus off of the hardware, the container, the card stock in this case. That is not the thing that actually provides someone access into. It's the credential that's stored on it. So once that clicked, in those roundtable discussions, they removed focus from the container that holds the credential and put focus on the credential itself, regardless of what container that credential is stored on. And I think that's very, very helpful for this space.
That's Yubico's Alex Antrim and Adam Oliver speaking with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.